Bruce Lee. He was a symbol that everybody could make it. Bruce became a symbol of the underdog for a lot of racialized minorities. Bruce was fighting for representation. Even folks who are still coming now to the US, they can find a resonance in the things that he went through. His image is something that kind of floats out there, separate of his movies, right? They're memes now, right? Bruce's image appearing on all these walls was this space to say, it's okay for us to imagine that things could be better than the way that they are. In that sense, he's a vessel, right? And we're the water.
Hello, everybody. My name is Charles Yao, and I'm host of Lavin Voices, a podcast from the Lavin Agency. My guest today is Jeff Chang, a culture writer and social historian. You'll likely know Jeff's first book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation. His new book, out this week, is another big one. It's called Water, Mirror, Echo, Bruce Lee and the Making of Asian America. It's the most comprehensive biography ever written about Bruce Lee. It charts not only his incredible life, but also his surprising afterlife, which holds amazing relevance for us today. Adam Mansbach, the #1 New York Times bestselling author, writes that Jeff's singular gift and talent is his ability to balance intimacy and grandeur, to tell the story of a movement, a nation, a generation, simply by telling the story of a man. That man, that myth, that legend is Bruce Lee, and I'm so happy to be talking about his life today with my good friend, Jeff Chang. Here's our conversation. Bruce Lee died in 1973. His last movie came out in 78. The biopic that I think most people know came out in 93. So that's a long time since we've been thinking about Bruce Lee. So why think about Bruce Lee now? What's his relevance?
I think Bruce is continuing to be a symbol of the underdog, of the person who is struggling to overcome. What we've seen in recent years is Bruce has become a symbol for massive social movements, right? Hong Kong, Catalonia, and he's regularly cited by people like, Klay Thompson and LeBron James and other athletes, who find all of his philosophies to be really relevant to their idea of how to enter the playing field, right? To literally get onto the court or the pitch even. The idea of flowing, being like water, right? All of these ideas are part of our worldwide discourse now. But I think also, too, there's a sense for those of us who are born of Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander descent in the U.S. or in North America as looking to him as kind of our hero, and it really came into relief for me for a lot of reasons during the pandemic. That's when violence against Asians and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians really began to peak, to surge. And simultaneous to that, his image started reappearing, in Chinatowns across the country, in Asian American communities across the country. He was a symbol of sort of solidarity and strength. So he's more relevant than ever, like more than 50 years after his passing, more than 50 years after his last movie.
Yeah, that's good. And we'll get back to some of those themes, the violence, his reception on the worldwide scale, but specifically within the Asian American community, because even I think on the census, Asian American did not come into play until 1980, right, which is 7 years after his passing. So how did Bruce come to encompass this thing we now know as Asian America?
It's a really interesting question, and it's something that I decided that I needed to try to kind of come to in the book. The book, just to give you a little thumbnail, it began just as a straight biography of Bruce, and I signed the contract a long time ago. I really came into understanding what the book needed to be, though, after the pandemic. That provided a really strong focus for me that it needed to be not just the story of Bruce, but the story of Asian America, because Bruce is probably the most famous Asian American who's ever lived. I'll take that back. He is the most famous Asian American who's ever lived, right? And that's actually a little known fact. He was born in San Francisco. So he was born American. via birthright citizenship, which is now under attack. And he came of age at the same time that folks in his generation were coming of age, the folks who would create the term Asian American. And he surged to prominence at the same time that the idea of Asian America began spreading all across North America. And so the rise of Bruce Lee and the rise of Asian America happened at the same time. And it's interesting to be able to think about the things that Bruce was going through in his life as reflective of what people in his broad generation were coming to and coming to conclusions about, that they needed to come together, that they needed to fight for their rights, and that they needed to establish themselves fully in the context of the civic and politic sort of milieu and landscape of America. They need to be recognized. And
Right.
Bruce's fight for recognition and Asian Americans' fight for recognition, same story in a lot of ways. There's a lot of interlinks and parallels, and that's why I wanted to weave them together.
Yeah, because as you say, like Bruce wasn't a policymaker, he wasn't a legislator,
No.
he wasn't even necessarily an
Mm-mm.
activist the way that we understand it. He was an actor. He was a kung fu martial arts school owner and instructor. So for the people that did make the pathways to create this category called Asian America and to have it officially recognized, what specifically did they draw from Bruce Lee? Was it just the iconography? Was it the movies?
Yeah. Well, Bruce became a symbol of the underdog for a lot of racialized minorities, because when kung fu movies first began to play in the US, they actually played the same theaters that blaxploitation movies played in. And that's, of course, due to racial segregation in the US, right? They were playing in inner city theaters. And so Black audiences, Latino audiences, urban poor white audiences were all streaming into these theaters to watch the movies in Chinatown with Asian American audiences. And I think that, at the beginning, some of the activists were like, this guy's not radical enough, right? He has no politics. But then actually they began to see his impact on all of these folks coming out of the theater literally feeling empowered, like, coming out, wanting to do kung fu, right? Everybody was kung fu fighting, right, by 1974. And I think that that's what made them come around, and that's the beginning of Bruce becoming sort of this symbol of empowerment for Asian Americans. The next generation, I'm in the next generation. I was like a baby, very young when Bruce was first coming out. But the next generation of us, the hip hop generation, we start putting him on T-shirts. We're like putting him behind turntables. We're making videos of him playing ping pong with nunchakus. So that was like I just remember the first issue of the Beastie Boys magazine, Grand Royal. This is something you appreciate, right? Had Bruce Lee and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on the cover, right? Because he was like such an icon for the hip hop generation. And that's why it continues with my kids. It's a whole new generation adopting Bruce Lee in new ways.
Right. Well, I don't have $700 in an eBay account, so I'll never see that first issue of Grand Royal in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But I mean, speaking of the way that it was the generation after Bruce Lee who took to his iconography, who took inspiration from him, is it your view that this next generation, one removed from his actual life, saw deeper resonances that maybe the people of his time didn't see? Or was it that the world changed? Like, what were they pulling out that others weren't during his life?
Just going back to this idea of like representation, right? Like, how are we seen in the world, So for anybody who grows up in my generation or afterwards, my kids' generation, right? We're now talking 2 generations since Bruce, right? The stereotype of Bruce Lee is there as well, right? So on the one hand, like it's a powerful image, and then on the other hand, it's something that you have to live up to on the playground, and so, but I would wager that most Asian Americans have had to deal with this kind of stereotype at one stage or another, right? It's just such a part of what the image of Asian Americans is about. And for for us, in that way, it's mixed, right? It's a there's a way in which Bruce Lee gave us representation, and then there's a way in which the image of him froze who we were to other people. So there's an important kind of thing to get at there, right? And so, and for me as a biographer, trying to come back to that, right? I'm looking at it through those kinds of eyes. I'm like, so what was his life really like? And to be able to find that, he lived an immigrant experience that was very similar to many, many others in this generation. Even folks who are still coming now to the U.S., they can find a resonance, I think, in the things that he went through, and because of that, he remains such a powerful symbol to us, despite the mixed, ambiguous, ambivalent kind of feelings that it creates for us to as we're out in the world.
Right. I mean, I can't imagine that it's healthy that one person stands in and
Yeah.
is the totality of representation for a group that consists of millions. And you talk a bit about the kind of two sides of the coin of Bruce Lee in the Asian American community, which is pride and shame.
Right.
Pride that people know him, white people know him, everyone knows him. That's amazing. And the shame of, well, but that's the only thing people know. Like, for instance, when I was growing up, people called me Bruce Lee.
Right.
I don't own a yellow tracksuit with a black stripe. I don't look anything like Bruce Lee. And it was always said in a very derogatory way. So can you talk a bit about that duality, but maybe some of the shame side?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, for people like my son, it was a type of situation where it was a source of pride. People were like, oh, like, you're probably badass because, you're Asian and you look like Bruce Lee, but it also forced him to feel like he needed to learn martial arts to defend himself. So, the larger story, of course, is that Bruce was fighting for representation. At the time that he was coming in, the images of Asian Americans was even worse, right? We were all, subservient to white culture in so many ways. And Bruce's breakout role, he was basically a butler for the Green Hornet. He was a driver and the cook, and the servant for the Green Hornet. And he was also the guy that was getting the Green Hornet out of all the trouble that he got himself into. So he was everything, right? He was everything. And I think that was a thing that Bruce came to understand. Wow, like I think I feel like I'm breaking through on a personal level, but Hollywood only sees me a certain kind of a way. So that was why he decided he had to leave Hollywood and go back to Asia, where he felt like he could be seen. But his struggle, I think, on an existential level, to be seen, to be recognized, that's still the very same struggle that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Hawaiians, in the continental U.S. are going through right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of, I mean, the role you mentioned in the Green Hornet, you played Kato,
Right.
and the show ran for 1 year. How successful do you think Bruce thought his goal of changing the dynamic and the representational awareness of Asian Americans was? Like, was he very explicit about broadening the kind of scope of how people thought about Asian Americans, or is that just something in retrospect that people apply to him?
No, he was, I think, very determined to break through. He knew what he didn't want to do. He knew that he didn't want to go to Hollywood and play Hop Sing on Bonanza. He knew that he didn't want to be sort of a chop chop type of character. He didn't want to be a sort of, Mr. Moto type of character. He didn't want to be a stereotype. And so he thought that by being able to showcase Kung Fu on this national TV show, he could show Asian Americans who are being badass and who had control, and could defend themselves. But I think as the show proceeded, when he goes into production, he's finding, oh, they haven't given me any lines at all. It took him like about halfway into the season before he really started getting lines. And then about 2/3 of the way through the season, he gets an episode in which he's actually able to advise them on how to include Kung Fu and they center the whole story on kung fu. And from there to the end of the show, he feels like he's doing a little bit better. But when he finishes, he's just really embarrassed because he realizes that he can't just jump into a new role. There's no upward ladder for him. There's no trajectory of him moving into any other type of role. He's got to play even worse roles than he played as Kato. And this proceeds for about 4 years until he decides, actually, I'm not going to get the kinds of roles that I really want and deserve and that portray Asians in the best light. At that time, there wasn't any term for Asian Americans, but that was basically and deeply what was on his mind. How can an Asian American, how can an Asian be seen in a was sort of the central problem that he was grappling with, and he decides that he has to go back to Asia and then try to figure out how to come back to the U.S. And
Right.
that's where the tragedy of Bruce Lee begins. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just for the people, who don't know of that era in popular culture, because now we have like shows like Beef, you have like Everything Everywhere All at Once. Representation is like okay. But at the time that Bruce was even playing Kato, like literally what was the representation of Asians in popular culture, if at all?
Yeah. It was women who were completely bound to their men. It was men who were completely bound to their patron, right? So again, Hop Sing, here's a character who is sort of the equivalent of a black minstrel, of what minstrels would have been in black representation, right? He runs around, he's the butt of the jokes, he speaks in a broken English. I mean, the actors who played these roles had like formal Shakespearean training in a lot of places, in a lot of ways, and they were forced to speak this Hollywood Chinese English. It wasn't even the kind of pidgin that you would hear in Chinatown. It was basically, me no worky long time or whatever. You know what I mean? It was like crazy. Like this is stuff that was entirely the stuff of the Hollywood imagination, of the white imagination in America.
Huh. Okay. So one role he didn't get was the
Yeah.
role in a show called Kung Fu, which
Hmm.
of course famously starred David Carradine, and for probably the longest time was the representation of what Kung Fu meant to most Americans.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about the history of that show? Because you talk about black minstrelsy, and the Chinese equivalent is yellowface.
Correct.
And some people would say the show Kung Fu with the white actor David Carradine is a version of that. But what's Bruce Lee's connection to that show?
Well, during this particular time, Chinese kung fu films and are just all the rage all through Southeast Asia. They're breaking all the box office records, and there's whispers of it that are coming over to the U.S. And these movies are playing in Chinatowns in the U.S. And there's a small contingent of sort of white folks and black folks and Latino folks who are going to these theaters at the beginning, right? Because like I said earlier, these are playing in segregated theaters. So these are like the new films coming from China, from Hong Kong. And at that particular point, when they started to figure out the dubbing situation, it was cheaper than doing subtitles. It was easier for them to do than subtitles. Then they really began to take off. And so Hollywood was looking for a way to try to bring these movies back to the U.S. as sort of the next stage after blaxploitation movies, and this is the way that Bruce begins to actually, find his way back to the U.S. But one of the scripts that was floating around Hollywood was a script written by two Jewish guys from New York that was attempting to make this sort of kung fu type of setting in the U.S. They wanted to call it an Eastern Western. And actually, simultaneous to that, Bruce was working on his own version of an Eastern Western that was actually set right around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so he was beginning to learn all of these histories about the Chinatowns that he had lived in. And he was putting it into what he would call warrior, And this is a TV show that, of course, was made, like decades after his death, almost 50 years after his death, it comes into being. But Kung Fu was the movie, or the TV show, excuse me, series that got moved forward. And so, of course, Bruce was a perfect candidate. And every Asian American actor in Hollywood was like, Bruce deserves his part. This is the part that we think Bruce should get. And so, the one of the guys at Warner Brothers sends him up for an audition, but the TV guy at Warner Brothers decides that nobody will understand his accent, and so despite the fact that he's the perfect person to play all this, he knows the philosophy, he knows kung fu. He's the most respected kung fu person in America at that particular point. He's known in all the kung fu circles already, um, and and he's got acting chops, right? They give the part to David Carradine, and they basically create Asian eyes, slant eyes on David Carradine, and they sort of put on a little bit of color, and David Carradine crouches a little bit so he looks smaller on screen. That's what he said. He said, "I wanted to look Asian, so I made myself smaller," which has so many layers of meaning right there, right? And that hits TV in 1972. By this time, Bruce is already in Hong Kong. He's a superstar in Asia, and when he finds out that he doesn't get the part, he's crushed, because this was going to be his way to be able to get his dual purpose of getting on screen and promoting Asian martial arts and philosophies in the U.S. And he has it snatched away from him in this sort of yellowface casting.
Right.
I think that drives him to into this path that leads towards the making of Enter the Dragon.
Yeah, just to put a pin and explore the martial arts thing for a while, because when Bruce landed in Seattle, when he came back to America, landed in Seattle, one of many of his dreams was to be a Hollywood star, or whatever, but also to open schools for martial arts. So can you talk a bit about his ambition to kind of be this guy who introduced Kung Fu and martial arts to America?
Yeah, it's interesting. He was thinking of it as a way to be able to, I think, just tell his parents, "Hey, I've got a good idea here. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to teach this thing that I really love doing, which is fighting in the streets, and then do it in a legit kind of way." Because he was a street fighter, right? And so he's like trying to go legit, and he tells his parents, "I'm going to go ahead and open up all these schools. When I get to the U.S., I'm going to teach them our arts, and I'm going to teach them our philosophies," which is something that appeals to his father, who wants him to be a good Chinese son, scholar, like versed in scholarly pursuits, a poet and a philosopher part time, and somebody who can also kick ass. Right? That's just sort of the ideal for his parents. And so this is what Bruce is trying to play up to. He gets to Seattle, and he immediately finds out that there's this whole counterculture that's starting up on the West Coast that's just about like looking towards, quote unquote, looking towards the East, right? So Alan Watts, the Beats poets, all of these folks are pursuing Eastern philosophy as a way to be able to distinguish themselves from their parents' generation. This is the incipient baby boomer sort of like, zeitgeist that's developing in the early 60s when Bruce lands in Seattle. And so Bruce is compelled to dive deeper into the philosophy, and he's compelled to dive deeper into the fighting. And his goal then at that particular point is to really like try to open up these schools. But when he gets the call from Hollywood, he actually lets it go, because he was a child actor. His father was an actor, and he loved the stage. And he felt that in a way, if he was able to get to that larger stage, he'd be able to have all of the things that he wanted. He'd be able to be respected as a fighter, but also be respected as a thinker and somebody who is being able to popularize and make the Asian scene in the U.S.
It's funny about the moment in the late 60s counterculture when North Americans were looking toward the East. Like, I know the Beatles had a lot of songs that had like sitar, stuff like
Hmm.
that. But in the same moment, Bruce, at least for a while, was immersing himself in kind of American style self help culture. So, can you talk a bit about some of the stuff that informed his ambition? Like, he read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill and books of that sort. So, what was his relationship to that sort of literature?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that he found in that literature a philosophy of self-actualization. He he he's in his 20s, right? Everybody in their 20s is searching for something. They're trying to discover who it is that they are. And I think that there's two things that really begin to make him American, right? It's in Seattle that he really becomes American, right? One is this encounter with other uh, poor white folks, black folks, Latino folks, and especially Japanese Americans in segregated Seattle. And so he learns what it means from them to be a racialized minority or somebody who's seen as an outcast from society, from dominant society. And I think that that's partly what begins to shape what it means for him to be an American, which is to be for the underdog. And then the other thing that he's drawn into is he's an inveterate reader. He loves to read. He's sort of autodidactic, and so he goes through the stores, and this is the literature that's the most popular during that time, right? The sort of Napoleon Hill Think and Grow Rich thing, the sort of the doctrine of positive thinking, right? This idea that you can make yourself whoever you want to be. Um, all of these ideas sort of lead to where we're at now, right? With the prosperity gospel and the sort of like the if I think it, I can be it, right? The sort of um, the if I believe I can fly type of like way of thinking, which is uniquely American. And so he's finding in these books actually an encouragement, right, to be able to pull himself up by his own bootstraps and to be able to make something of himself. And so he creates this really interesting sort of self philosophy that mixes up Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and this sort of American self help kinds of doctrines.
Right, right. Kind of pick and choose.
Yeah.
The old buffet. Kung Fu at core. I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong. In Bruce's words and through your book, it's hard work. It's a timely devotion to craft with the distant promise of achievement. Bruce's quote is, "It's you should rigorously prepare, but do not over premeditate. You should focus on closing the gap between thought and act, intention and impact." So that's a lot of stuff that's in play now around resilience, around perseverance, around grit. What are some lessons around those concepts that Bruce can impart?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that we've really seen over the last 20 years is this sort of development of looking at Bruce as not just like the founder of mixed martial arts, but also as a key figure in thinking about the evolving American sort of notion of self-actualization and self-help, right? So we've seen the phrases that he's sort of he had taken to heart, like moving be like water, still be like a mirror, respond like an echo, the sort of core poem from Taoism that forms the sort of theme that brings the book together. But also these ideas of like be self-reliant, which of course tap deep into Emersonian sorts of philosophies, right? And the notion that it's in you, right? That you make your way. And so I think, we see now Bruce as like this person who really ignites people on a whole bunch of different types of levels. Um, and, uh, and, and I think in particular at this moment, um, themes of resilience, themes of sort of perseverance, themes of balance, all of these types of themes Bruce seems to be able to speak to. There's always a quote that somebody can pull out to sort of point to that then folks can use in their lives, and he's become sort of the all-purpose philosopher for the 20th century in a way.
Right. And because you mentioned at the beginning of the call that in the current day, when there is protests, when there are revolutionary movements in Barcelona a few years ago with the secession movement in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the early 2000s, the 2019 Hong Kong, I guess, pro-democracy demonstrations, like, how did this come about? How did he become the kind of Che Guevara type figure? And also, as with Che Guevara, is there a danger in just kind of streamlining that image to a guy in a pose ready to fight?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do with the mystery of Bruce Lee, right? The sort of the fact that he died so young, uh, and then that his image is something that kind of floats out there, separate of his movies, right? They're memes now, right? There's all like him standing there in a pose, in dark glasses can be put with a set of turntables, and then he's suddenly a hip hop DJ, right? His image is flexible. It's infinitely flexible. But I think at core, he stands for the everyman or the every person. And in that regard, when in the Balkans they were trying to find an image that would unite different ethnicities, folks settled on Bruce because he was everybody's underdog. He was a symbol that everybody could make it, and he was also a symbol of unity in that regard as well. So I think that he continues to be that person who people can project their sort of greatest hopes onto, which is just an amazing and it's a powerful thing. What I want folks to kind of get at and understand is what his real story was. Because I think the other part of the reason that he can be such a flexible symbol is because so few people really know the story of Asian America. And so what I hope people will get out of the book is a better sense of the specificity of who he was, the times that he lived through, how he was shaped by war, as many people in Asian America have been, how the migration experience shaped him, how the experience of becoming an American, being racialized as an Asian, transformed him and turned him into a symbol of the underdog. And I actually think that when you look at all this, it intensifies, it adds to more of the power of Bruce's image. So that's what I was trying to tell in the book. That's the story I was trying to tell in the book.
Yeah, no, that's good because he came of age from 40 to 73. And in the backdrop of that time in American history, there were two of the wars, World War II, the Vietnam War, where Asian people were the enemy, were seen as the enemy. And there was Bruce in the United States. So can you talk about some of the personal sort of racism and cultural racism that he experienced?
Yeah, well, there were 3 wars actually, and Bruce was
Right, the Korean.
There's a Korean War as well, and that's relevant because Bruce, when he went to college, he was automatically put into ROTC. He was training to as all young men needed to at that time, all able-bodied young men needed to at that time, to go to war, right? To go to staff the bases on the DMZ in Korea, right? And then Vietnam wrapped up shortly after he leaves college. Just literally months after he leaves college, the ramp up and the mobilization for the war in Vietnam begins. But he was deeply shaped by war because he nearly starved to death as a child in war-torn Hong Kong, in Japanese-occupied Hong Kong. And And so, that experience, and then the subsequent migration that happens to Hong Kong when when Mao wins the Chinese Civil War in 1949, um, that shapes all of his life. Literally, all of these people pour into Hong Kong from all over of China, bringing with them their different fighting styles. There's a huge youth population. People get into fights, and there's a fight culture that develops. And that's the fight culture in which Bruce becomes a martial artist for the first time. You know, so all of this sort of backdrop of war is something that's deeply ingrained, I think, in the Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian experience. This is the sort of untold story, in many ways, of our experience, one that's beginning to really be told through writers like Viet Thanh Nguyen, Ocean Vuong, Kathy Park Hong, and also has been told for many, many years in the sort of literature of Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans and South Asian Americans as well. It's been there. It just hasn't been seen as much in the mainstream culture, but it's been deep to the sense of who we are as Asian Americans.
Right. All that history bearing down
Right.
on Bruce during his lifetime. So we'll wrap it up quickly, but we got to talk about the movies because
Sure.
that's what he's primarily known for.
1,000%. Yeah.
When we're talking about the movies, it's basically The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of Dragon, Enter the Dragon, and then posthumously the it's Game of Death, Mask of Death.
Game
But a lot of the roles, the things that tie these movies together is that you're right, like thinking it through. Bruce plays usually the underdog.
Mm-hmm.
He plays somebody fighting oppression, freeing enslaved people, standing up for the downtrodden. How much of that was a conscious effort to portray that sort of character throughout his career? It's almost like an exact through line of character.
Yeah, I think it was definitely intentional the whole way through. Part of it is circumstance, right? I mean, those are the movies that were popular. Kung fu movies, it's that's sort of the nature of kung fu movies. It's the nature of kung fu, right? The word means hard work. It doesn't mean fighting styles or martial arts. It means hard work. And the notion, of course, is that through hard work you'll overcome. And so, it was a genre that he was in, but it was also sort of the image that he cultivated, and it was informed by his time as an Asian American, as an immigrant living in the U.S. in segregated communities, and being seen, as somebody who was not fully American. So I think that that when we look back at his work, the through line that's there is there, because he wanted to play those roles, and that was what he wanted to be able to express, and so even though it's a small body of work, and who knows what he might have gone on to do had he not, passed away on the eve of his big breakthrough with the Enter the Dragon, it becomes a sort of unified image again that people can project onto their hopes and their dreams for individual and mass redemption.
Yeah. Talk about Asian American, the experience. One thing that binds it, sadly, is kind of hatred and violence, as you point out in your book, the kind of historical scale of wars, but also the interpersonal, the racism, the microaggressions. You have a part at the end of the book where, you're leaving a theater, guy pulls up to you, says the C word. Literally every Asian person I've ever met in my life has that exact story. It's happened to me. It's happened to everybody I've ever met. It's always the same story. Right. So there are all these levels of violence. But then Bruce Lee is in these movies, which are like, they're ostensibly violent movies. So what's the relationship between violence and Bruce Lee here and the Asian American experience?
Okay, that's a huge question that we could talk about for hours, but I'll just say this. One of the things that animated me again to sort of do the book in the form that I did it, because it could have just been a straight biography, was to be able to kind of reflect on what Bruce means and in the kind of context of right now. And what we see over and over again in Asian American history is that since the 60s, is that when violence happens to us, it's usually mistaken identity, right? It's you know, in the 40s, Asians were mistaken for Japanese, foreigners, right? Um, and of course, more recently in the pandemic, we've been, no matter what our background, been mistaken for Chinese, and scapegoated as such, right? But it doesn't turn us into Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans. It turns us into Asian Americans, because the notion of Asian American affords us and allows us a sense of solidarity, and through solidarity, some protection. Um, but it begins with self-defense. How do we begin to defend ourselves? And I think that that's where Bruce's image of strength begins to come in. And then, you know, the reaction out of that is, well, how do we get people to see us? You know, and I think that plays into this idea of representation, whether that be on the screen or in the halls of power, or in the halls of big businesses or universities, right? Like representation, right? So self-defense leads us to demanding a seat at the table, right? But the seat at the table is not sufficient for us to all be able to feel like we're going to be safe on the streets. And so that's what solidarity is all about, right? It's ultimately about us being able to be seen, recognized. People come to our aid, and we come to other people's aid. And I think that that's where Bruce's image has this expansiveness that people are able to find themselves in, right? Is not just the self-defense, not just the being seen, but this idea that we can help others and others can help us, and we'll all be able to make it through together, right? That's the heroic part of it, is this leap from representation into solidarity, and this broad solidarity, so that people from Bosnia, to Hong Kong, to Barcelona, can find themselves in Bruce.
Right.
And I think that that's ultimately the most powerful thing about how his image lingers with us, is that it still gives us and affords us the opportunity to glimpse what it could look like if we all went together.
Right. What it could look like. And solidarity is one of your great sort of meta themes throughout all your work,
It's
from
my
Camp
through line.
uh,
Yeah.
solidarity among racialized minorities, white people, amongst everybody. The other great theme of your work, and we can wrap it up here, is I remember when we started working together, you always used to say this phrase that culture moves before politics,
Mm-hmm.
meaning like the arts, creativity, they kind of anticipate where the world is going more than any sort of regulatory body might shape it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still true in 2025? And is there a connection to Bruce Lee and his artistry and his social change?
Yeah, I think so. I think, what we saw, for instance, in Bruce's image appearing on all these walls during the pandemic in Asian American communities was this space to say it's okay for us to imagine that things could be better than the way that they are, because he is that, right? He's in that sense, he's a vessel, right? And we're the water, right? So it's, yeah, so it's sort of a way of being able to put ourselves in a place where we can begin to actualize things. And I think that's what culture does. I think culture ultimately is the space where we dream together, and it's the space where we begin to make things together. and law is downstream from that, right? To continue with the water metaphor, law is just one of the ways in which we codify those intentions and those dreams that we've had. And so I'm just a student, a lover, a devotee of culture, and all the ways in which we can move in it and through it. So thanks for that question.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
That was amazing. We do these conversations with Lavin speakers every week. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Jeff or our other Lavin speakers, visit thelavinagency.com. Thanks for listening.